Gareth burst into our living room like he was kicking in a door, planted himself right in front of the TV, and barked, "Go to your room, old people. This is my house." The words hit so fast my mind did that old man thing where it replays a sentence twice, like a scratched record, just to confirm it really happened. My wife Nadine's hand froze around her tea, and I felt a sharp, stupid heat crawl up my neck, the kind that says, "You're being humiliated and everyone can see it." I looked past him to our daughter, Maris, waiting for her to snap at him, to correct him, to do anything that sounded like family. Instead, Maris avoided my eyes like they were a bright light she couldn't stand, grabbed her keys off the side table, and walked out as if we were invisible furniture. The front door slammed so hard the framed photo of us at her college graduation tilted sideways, and that little detail almost made me laugh, because even our memories were getting shoved around. Gareth didn't just smile. He wore a grin that said he'd been rehearsing this moment in his head for months, polishing it like a trophy. I tried to stand up quickly, out of pure instinct, but my knee popped loud enough to sound like a microwave button, and for 1 second I hated my own body for giving him a free punchline. I heard myself think, so this is it. This is the age where your dignity depends on whether your joints cooperate. I took one slow breath, tasted yesterday's coffee on my tongue, and said, "You don't speak to us like that in a home where we've ever been loved." He scoffed and replied, "Love doesn't pay bills," as if love was some expired coupon he'd finally found an excuse to throw away. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing, but for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. Nadine stepped forward, calm but pale, and I could tell she was doing that quiet older person math, counting how many seconds she had before her voice cracked. Gareth pointed down the hallway like a landlord ordering tenants around and said, "Room. Now, I'm done pretending." We walked away not because we agreed, but because arguing in the open felt like letting him enjoy the show. And at our age you learn when silence is the sharpest blade you're allowed to carry. Inside our bedroom, I closed the door gently, too gently, and my hands shook anyway, because anger doesn't always come with shouting. Sometimes it comes with tremors you can't control. Then I heard him in the kitchen, whistling like a man who'd just rearranged the world with one sentence, and I realized this wasn't a bad mood. This was a plan. The next morning the doorbell rang, and through the peephole I saw a man in a tailored suit, holding a leather folder like it weighed more than paper, like it carried consequences. He looked straight at me and said, "Mr. Caldwell, I'm here about the legal status of this property, and your son-in-law's name is already on my paperwork." The folder opened, and I saw my daughter's signature on a page I'd never been shown. In that moment, my stomach dropped, not from fear of losing a house, but from realizing we might have already been handled while we were still living inside our own lives. The man in the suit introduced himself as Leonard Hale, and he spoke softly, the way people do when they're about to say something sharp and don't want blood on their shoes. He stepped inside without asking, glanced around our living room, and nodded as if he were inspecting a hotel he'd already decided to downgrade. I noticed his shoes cost more than my monthly groceries, which felt like an odd detail to focus on. But when you're scared, your mind grabs onto anything solid. Leonard opened his folder and explained that documents had been filed transferring usage rights of the house, a phrase so polite it almost sounded like a compliment. I asked him to repeat it, partly because I wanted clarity and partly because my hearing aid chose that exact moment to whistle like a kettle. He did repeat it, slower this time, and added that Maris had signed as a consenting party, while Gareth was listed as the primary resident. I laughed once, short and dry, because laughter sometimes arrives before pain, like it's trying to cushion the fall. I told him there had to be a mistake, that my wife and I had lived here for decades, paid taxes faithfully, and argued with the same squeaky floorboard longer than Gareth had been alive. Leonard adjusted his glasses and said, "Length of residence doesn't always equal control," which sounded like something written by someone who's never grown old in one place. Behind him, the TV was still paused on a cooking show, the host smiling mid-chop, and I thought about how even vegetables got more respect than we did at that moment. I felt Nadine's presence behind me, steady as a wall, and I realized she hadn't spoken yet because she was storing her strength instead of wasting it. Leonard mentioned timelines, notices, and potential relocation, words that made my chest tighten like someone had tied a string around my ribs. I asked him straight out if Gareth planned to push us out, and Leonard hesitated just long enough to tell me the answer without saying it. That hesitation hurt more than any insult, because it confirmed this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was strategy. As Leonard gathered his papers, he said we'd be hearing more very soon, then paused and added, "It might be easier if you cooperate." After he left, I tried to sit down and missed the chair by an inch, catching myself on the armrest and muttering that even the furniture was turning against me. Nadine finally spoke and said, quietly, "They think we'll fold." And I knew then this wasn't about a house anymore. It was about proving whether age had made us invisible. That evening, when Gareth came home humming like nothing had happened, he dropped one sentence over his shoulder that told me tomorrow would be worse. Gareth didn't even look at us when he came in that night, just tossed his keys into a bowl like a king dropping coins and announced that starting tomorrow we'd need to coordinate schedules. I asked him what that meant, even though I already felt the answer settling in my stomach like bad soup. He said it meant fewer shared spaces, fewer questions, and absolutely no wandering around during the day, as if Nadine and I were unruly pets that needed boundaries. I nodded slowly, partly to keep myself from saying something regrettable and partly because my neck stiffened when I get angry, a small betrayal my body performs without asking me first. Inside my head, a quieter voice whispered that I used to be a man people listened to, a man who made decisions, not a man being issued house rules by someone who still left dirty mugs everywhere. When I went to the kitchen later, I noticed Gareth had taped a printed schedule to the fridge, complete with color-coded blocks, and I almost admired the effort before realizing one block simply read Parents' Room. I joked to Nadine that at least we'd finally been assigned a hobby, and she smiled thinly, the kind of smile that means she heard the joke but didn't feel it. That night, sleep wouldn't come, and I lay staring at the ceiling fan clicking unevenly, counting rotations like it was a metronome for my thoughts. I kept replaying moments from Maris's childhood, her first bike, her graduation cap slipping sideways, and wondering when I'd become someone she could sign away without a conversation. In the morning, Gareth announced breakfast rules too, saying it would be simpler if we ate after he left for work, which felt less like a suggestion and more like an eviction rehearsal. I burned my toast so badly the smoke alarm went off, and for one ridiculous second I hoped it might summon a fire marshal who'd asked too many questions. Instead, Gareth yelled from the hallway to handle it, and I waved a dish towel at the alarm like a surrender flag, muttering that I was now officially a danger to myself and society. When the house finally went quiet, Nadine and I sat at the small table, our knees almost touching, and she reached for my hand like she was checking I was still there. I told her we might need help, legal help, and saying it out loud felt like admitting defeat even though my mind knew it was strategy. She squeezed my fingers once and said, "We didn't raise a tyrant, but we married into one." And that sentence carried more truth than any document Leonard had shown me. That afternoon, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years, searching for old paperwork, and found things I thought were lost, receipts, notes, and one envelope that made my pulse jump. As I stared at that envelope, I realized Garrett's confidence came from assuming we were finished, and tomorrow I intended to show him how wrong that assumption might be. I opened that envelope at the desk where I used to pay bills, the wood worn smooth by decades of careful hands, and for a moment I just sat there listening to my own breathing. Inside were copies of documents I'd kept out of habit, not paranoia, old deeds, tax records, signatures that still carried weight even if my voice apparently didn't. I felt a strange mix of relief and shame. Relief that I hadn't been as foolish as Gareth assumed, and shame that I was now rummaging through my own history like a man looking for proof he existed. Nadine hovered nearby, pretending to dust, which is what she does when she's nervous, even though the same shelf somehow gets dusted 3 times in 1 minute. I told her quietly that not everything was as Gareth thought, and she raised an eyebrow in that way she does when hope tries to sneak back in but isn't fully trusted yet. Before we could say more, Gareth barged in and asked what we were whispering about, his tone casual but his eyes sharp, like he expected secrets to spill out of our pockets. I smiled at him and said we were discussing whether the house always leaned slightly to the left or if that was just our knees giving up, and for a split second, he didn't know whether to laugh or feel mocked. He chose annoyance, which told me humor still worked. It just had to be quiet and precise. That afternoon, he announced he'd be working from home more, which sounded less like a career choice and more like surveillance. Every step I took felt observed, even when I went to the bathroom and the light flickered because someone had replaced the bulb with the wrong wattage. I caught myself apologizing to the house under my breath for the tension, a ridiculous habit I'd developed, as if walls could remember loyalty better than people. When Maris finally came home that evening, she didn't look at us directly, speaking to Gareth instead, as if we were part of the furniture arrangement. I asked her one simple question, why she hadn't told us about the paperwork, and her silence landed heavier than any shouted answer. She shrugged and said, "It was just easier this way." And I realized then how often easier is used to excuse cruelty when patience runs out. That night, lying in bed, I understood something clearly for the first time. They weren't just taking space, they were testing how small they could make us feel. And tomorrow, I knew, would bring a moment where staying quiet would cost us more than speaking up ever could. The breaking point came the next morning, not with shouting, but with paperwork laid neatly on the counter like a trap disguised as order. Gareth slid a folder toward me and said it would be helpful if we signed an acknowledgement of his residency rights, using that polite voice people reserve for children and the elderly. I asked what would happen if we didn't, and he shrugged, saying, "Then things get uncomfortable," as if discomfort were a weather condition he could schedule. I flipped through the pages slowly, buying time, pretending my eyes were the problem when it was my heart that needed a moment to steady itself. One line caught my attention, a quiet clause about temporary occupants, and I felt something inside me tighten, not fear this time, but resolve. I joked that my glasses must be outdated because they couldn't read nonsense, and Nadine snorted before she could stop herself, which earned us a glare sharp enough to cut paper. Maris hovered by the doorway, arms crossed, watching like a referee who'd already decided not to call fouls. I asked her, gently, if she remembered the day we carried her into this house wrapped in a yellow blanket, and she flinched like I'd spoken too loudly in a library. Gareth told me not to manipulate her with sentiment, and I realized he truly believed memories were a weakness instead of a record. My hands shook as I closed the folder and slid it back to him, and I hated that my body betrayed how much this mattered. I said we wouldn't be signing anything today, or tomorrow, or ever without our own counsel, and the room went still in that dangerous way silence does before it turns. He laughed, short and sharp, and said we were outmatched, that age had made us slow, and that the law favored current contributors. I stood up carefully, bracing on the counter, and replied that slow doesn't mean stupid, it means thorough, and that thorough men keep copies. For a moment, doubt flickered across his face, and I knew I'd finally stepped on a nerve instead of a mine. As he walked away muttering about deadlines, I caught Nadine's eye, and in that look was the shared understanding that we'd reached the bottom. Because once you stop being afraid of losing what's already been taken, you're finally free to fight back. And tomorrow, Nadine would be the one to speak.
I had stayed quiet for days, not because I was weak, but because I was listening, and listening tells you far more than shouting ever does. That morning, I woke before everyone else, the house creaking like it always had, as if it recognized me even when people didn't. I made coffee and forgot it on the counter, reheated it twice, and still drank it cold because my thoughts were louder than my habits. I watched Gareth move through the kitchen later like a man measuring walls, opening cabinets he'd never stocked, touching things he hadn't earned, and I felt something steady harden inside my chest. When he reminded us of his timeline, I smiled politely, the kind of smile women my age perfect after decades of swallowing comments at dinner tables. I told him we'd heard him clearly and that he shouldn't confuse silence with agreement, because those are very different animals. He laughed and said I was being dramatic, and I thought how strange it was that men often call clarity drama when it doesn't serve them. Maris avoided my eyes again, pretending to scroll through her phone, and I realized she wasn't cruel. She was cowardly, which somehow hurt more. I went to our room and opened my old sewing box, not because I needed thread, but because important things tend to hide near tools people underestimate. Under spools and bent needles were letters, copies, and a small notebook where I'd written dates and notes for years, a habit my husband used to tease me about. I smiled to myself, remembering how he'd called it my worry journal, and thought how funny it was that worry had finally paid rent. At lunch, Gareth announced he'd be inviting people over to discuss renovations, and I asked him if that meant walls or people were being removed first. He didn't like that, but he didn't answer either, which told me I'd hit closer than he expected. That afternoon, I called a number I hadn't dialed in years, my voice steady even as my hands trembled, and asked for an appointment, not a favor. When I hung up, I felt taller, not younger, just heavier in a good way, like I was finally standing on my own spine again. As evening came and Gareth complained about dinner being late, I set the table carefully, placing forks straight, because control often begins with small, deliberate acts. I looked at my husband across the table and nodded once, letting him know the quiet phase was over. Because when a woman like me finally starts speaking, it isn't noise, it's a reckoning. The appointment I made wasn't dramatic, and that mattered to me because real power rarely arrives with raised voices or slammed doors. I put on my good coat, the one my husband says makes me look too serious for grocery shopping, and waited for Gareth to ask where I was going. He didn't ask, which told me he assumed I no longer went anywhere important, a mistake men like him make when women stop announcing themselves. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of old books and lemon cleaner, and I remember thinking it felt comforting, like a place where words were treated carefully. I spoke plainly, without tears, without embellishment, laying out dates, signatures, habits, and patterns the way only someone who's lived a life can do. When I finished, the lawyer leaned back and said, "That's not what your son-in-law thinks it is," and those 8 words felt like oxygen after days underwater. I laughed softly, surprising myself, and said I was relieved to hear that my memory hadn't gone the way Gareth seemed to hope it had. On the way home, I tripped on a crack in the sidewalk and muttered that even my feet were trying to sabotage my comeback, then laughed again because staying upright at 60 is its own quiet victory. Back at the house, Gareth was on the phone, talking loudly about timelines and control, and I noticed how often men speak louder when they're less certain. I walked past him without stopping, which annoyed him more than any argument could have. That evening, Maris finally tried to speak to me, her voice hesitant, asking if we were making things complicated. I told her calmly that complicated is what happens when you ignore people until they have no choice but to be precise. She cried then, softly, and I felt that familiar pull to comfort her, the instinct that never really leaves, even when it's been misused. But this time I stayed seated, hands folded, because love doesn't always mean stepping forward, it sometimes means standing firm. Later, I shared everything with my husband, watching his shoulders lift slightly as if a weight had been adjusted, not removed, but shifted into a manageable place. We went to bed knowing something Gareth didn't. Confidence built on assumptions cracks the moment facts knock on the door. And tomorrow, those facts were coming with papers, signatures, and a tone that didn't ask permission to be heard. The papers arrived the next afternoon in a plain envelope, no drama on the outside, which felt appropriate because truth rarely needs decoration. I set them on the table and smoothed the edges, a habit I have when I'm nervous, even though the pages were already perfectly straight. Gareth noticed immediately, of course he did, because people who crave control have an instinct for anything they didn't authorize. He asked what that was, trying to sound casual, and I told him it was information, which made his jaw tighten in a way that almost made me feel sorry for him. Almost. My husband sat beside me, quiet but solid, his knee bouncing slightly until he caught himself and stilled it with a small, embarrassed smile that said, "Old habits die hard." I began reading aloud, slowly, clearly, not raising my voice once, because I wanted every word to land exactly where it belonged. The documents explained ownership, authority, and consent in terms so precise there was no room for imagination, and I watched Gareth's confidence shrink line by line. He interrupted twice, claiming technicalities, but I kept going, the way you do when you know the recipe and refuse to let someone rush you. Maris stood frozen near the doorway, her hands clasped together like she was bracing for impact, and for the first time, she actually looked at us. When I reached the section about invalid signatures and misrepresentation, Gareth laughed nervously and said lawyers could twist anything, which is what people say when they feel the ground moving. I replied that yes, lawyers can twist things, but facts tend to snap back, and this time they were snapping in our direction. My husband leaned forward and said, very calmly, that he'd spent 40 years reading fine print and that Gareth had mistaken age for ignorance. I'll admit, hearing that made my chest warm in a way no victory speech ever could. Gareth accused us of planning this behind his back, and I reminded him that privacy isn't secrecy, it's a right you lose when you start issuing orders. At one point, my husband tried to stand and knocked his elbow into the table, sending a pen rolling onto the floor, and he muttered that even dramatic moments come with slapstick at our age. No one laughed, but I squeezed his hand, grateful for the normalcy of that small, human moment. By the end, Gareth wasn't shouting anymore. He was bargaining, which told me everything I needed to know. Because when someone who claimed power starts asking questions instead of giving commands, the balance has already shifted, and tomorrow would decide who truly held the house. That night, the house felt different, not quieter, but alert, like it knew a decision was forming inside its walls. Gareth stayed up late, pacing, opening and closing doors too softly, the way people do when they don't want to admit they're nervous. I lay awake beside my husband, listening to his breathing even out, thinking how strange it was that after 40 years together, danger had made him sleep more deeply, not less. In the morning, Gareth announced we needed a family meeting, using the word family like a tool he'd suddenly remembered how to pick up. He sat at the table first, choosing the chair my husband usually took, and I noticed my husband hesitate for half a second before choosing another seat, a small thing that still stung. I cleared my throat and said calmly that seats don't decide authority, which made Gareth shift uncomfortably, as if the chair itself had betrayed him. He tried a new tone then, reasonable, almost kind, and suggested we find a compromise where everyone wins, which is often code for please stop before I lose. Maris spoke up, finally, saying she never meant for things to go this far, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from asking how far she thought eviction papers usually go. Instead, I told her that intentions don't erase outcomes, and that adults are judged by what they sign, not what they claim they felt. My husband attempted to pour coffee and missed the mug, sending a small splash onto the table, and he sighed, saying, "Even my hands know this is a big day." I handed him a napkin, and that quiet teamwork felt more powerful than any argument happening in the room. Gareth proposed we move out temporarily, promising access, visits, respect, all the things he'd already failed to give us under no pressure at all. I asked him, gently, why he thought we'd trust promises from someone who thought silence meant surrender. He snapped then, just for a moment, accusing us of turning his own house against him, and I saw panic flash through the anger like a crack of lightning. I stood up slowly, feeling every year in my knees, and said this house wasn't against him, it was simply refusing to lie anymore. My husband rose too, slower than me, but steadier than Gareth expected, and said we'd already decided our next step. When Gareth demanded to know what that step was, I looked him straight in the eye and replied that he'd find out soon enough, in writing and in front of witnesses. The room went silent, and in that silence I understood something clearly. The man who once ordered us into a bedroom no longer knew where he stood. The final meeting happened 3 days later, and by then I no longer felt nervous, just tired in a clear, honest way, the kind of tired that comes after carrying something heavy to its proper place. Leonard Hale returned, the same calm suit, the same measured voice, but this time he didn't look at Gareth first. He addressed my husband and me as if that order had always been correct. He laid the documents out carefully and explained, step by step, that the house had never legally transferred control, that signatures had been misused, and that certain assumptions had been made without authority. Gareth kept interrupting until Leonard raised one finger and said, politely, "Please let me finish," and I almost smiled because nothing rattles a bully like professional calm. Maris sat pale and silent, finally seeing the difference between confidence and confidence, and I felt a quiet sadness that she had needed this lesson taught so publicly. My husband listened intently, nodding once in a while, his hands folded together, except when he tried to stand too fast and had to sit back down with a soft groan, muttering that victory apparently required patience from his knees, too. Leonard concluded by stating that Gareth would need to vacate the house within a set period, and that any further interference would be handled formally, not emotionally. Gareth stared at the papers as if they'd personally betrayed him, and when he looked up, his voice cracked, not loud, not dramatic, just empty. He asked what we wanted now, and for the first time since this began, the question wasn't a challenge, it was a surrender. I told him calmly that we wanted our home returned to its proper balance, not revenge, not apologies performed for convenience, but distance and respect. Maris finally cried openly then, and I held her hand, because consequences don't cancel love, they redefine its boundaries. When Gareth packed his things, my husband helped him carry one box, grumbling that it was heavier than expected and joking that even justice came with lifting restrictions. The front door closed softly behind them, not slammed, not dramatic, and the house seemed to exhale. That evening, my husband and I sat in the living room again, the television on, the volume too loud because neither of us bothered adjusting it right away. He reached for my hand, squeezed it, and said, "We didn't break," and I answered, "No, we remembered who we were." The house was ours again, not because of papers or law, but because we had stood our ground when it mattered most.